Hi there. Welcome back to Haunting Vales. Today, we are going to talk about The Last Lock, a mystery woven through shadows and whispers, where every turn of the key brings you closer to a truth you might wish had stayed hidden. Asterisk. Chapter 1. The Last Bid. London in late October was a city caught between the dying light of autumn and the early shadows of winter. The rain that night was not the violent, thrashing kind that sent umbrellas snapping in the wind, but a fine and ceaseless drizzle, a silver mist that seemed to settle into the skin and cling to the edges of one's clothes. It glossed the cobblestones of Berkeley Street until they gleamed like sheets of dark glass beneath the glow of gas lamps, their light refracting in tiny halos with every drop that slid down the glass chimneys. The clip-clop of carriage hoofs, mixed with the occasional low growl of motor cars, both dulled by the damp air. From the pavement, the grand facade of the Harrington Auction House rose in stately symmetry, its stonework carved in an age when such places were built to inspire both reverence and a sense of one's own financial insignificance. Corinthian columns guarded the great oak doors, their capitals wrapped in acanthus leaves that caught rainwater in their grooves. Above the arched entryway, an ornate pediment displayed the Harrington family crest, two rampant lions flanking, a shield crossed with a hammer and quill, symbols of commerce and culture entwined. The building's windows, tall and arched, glowed with a warm amber light that promised a welcome far from the wet streets. And inside, that promise was kept. A rush of warmth greeted every guest as they crossed the threshold, mingling with the faint scent of polished mahogany, beeswax, and the delicate perfume of ladies who had taken great care to dress for the evening. The Harrington Auction House did not host casual events. The midnight auction was one of London's most exclusive gatherings, an occasion that drew together the city's wealthiest collectors, its most eccentric enthusiasts, and those mysterious few who seemed to attend such events without anyone quite knowing what they collected or why. Tonight's catalog was heavy with fine things. Ancient manuscripts bound in cracking leather, jewelry that had graced the throats and wrists of queens, porcelain so delicate it seemed to hum with fragility under the lights. But there was one item above all that had caught the city's breath and held it for weeks: a Faberge egg, its origins whispered about in drawing rooms and private clubs. Officially, it was said to have been commissioned in 1897 for a Russian duchess whose name had been lost to history in the chaos of revolution. Unofficially, there were rumors, unsubstantiated but persistent, that the egg contained a hidden compartment, and within it, something so valuable and dangerous that its true nature had never been publicly revealed. Whether this was mere romantic invention or an echo of fact, the story was enough to draw bidders from across Europe and beyond. Standing just inside the main entrance, his back perfectly straight, was a small man with an egg-shaped head and a mustache of such precise grooming that it seemed to defy the damp air entirely. Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective, did not attend auctions as a matter of habit, but when one is invited by Lady Eleanor Ashworth, a woman of considerable influence in both society and the arts, one does not refuse lightly. Her letter had been discreet, as her manner always was, but her words hinted at unease. "There is a possibility," she had written, "that an unpleasantness might occur. I cannot elaborate in writing. Please come if you can." And so Poirot had come. He stood now in his immaculate black dinner suit, gloves of the finest kid, leather covering his hands, a silver-tipped cane resting lightly before him. His eyes moved slowly, methodically, across the room, cataloging not objects but people. For Poirot, a gathering of this sort was not merely a social event. It was a tapestry of human behavior, woven in threads of pride, greed, nervousness, and ambition. To the far side of the great hall, beneath a balcony draped in crimson velvet, The auctioneer spoke quietly to his assistants. He was a tall, thin man whose hair, white as frost, seemed perpetually in danger of being displaced by the slightest breeze. His eyes were small, quick, and restless, darting from one guest to another, as if he were already calculating the evening's profits. Near him, Lady Eleanor stood in conversation with a portly gentleman in a high-collared coat. She was resplendent in emerald silk, a matching feather fixed into the dark coils of her hair. Her manner was composed, but her eyes moved more than. Her lips, scanning the crowd with a subtle wariness that reminded Poirot of her letter. Closer to Poirot's position, two figures caught his attention. The first was a tall man with a hooked nose and slicked black hair, dressed in a dark suit, cut slightly too sharply for English taste, his cufflinks flashing each time he gestured with long, pale fingers. He was speaking in a low voice to a young woman who seemed barely out of her 20s. Her eyes were wide, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a small clutch bag as though it contained her last line of defense against the world. Poirot noted the way the man leaned in too close, his smile a shade too thin, his gaze fixed not on her face, but on her clutch. A small frown creased Poirot's brow, though he did not move. He never interrupted such scenes without first understanding them. The evening began with the smaller lots. A silver snuff-box inlaid with turquoise, said to have belonged to a French diplomat, an oil painting from an obscure Dutch master, its brushstrokes visible in the soft lighting, a 19th-century compass that had accompanied an Arctic expedition. The bidding was polite, restrained, voices rising and falling like gentle waves on a calm shore. But the air in the room changed as the final lot was announced that a velvet-lined case was brought forward and placed under the warm beam of a spotlight. The auctioneer's assistant opened it with a careful flourish, and there it was, the Faberge egg, a masterpiece of gold and enamel, its surface a lattice of delicate patterns inlaid with diamonds no larger than a pinhead. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the hall. The egg seemed to capture and hold the light itself, each facet glinting with a subtlety that spoke not of gaudy wealth, but of perfect craftsmanship. The bidding began at £50,000. Lord Winthrop, a ruddy-faced man with an air of entitlement so thick it clung to him like cigar smoke, raised his paddle without hesitation. The hawk-nosed man followed immediately, his face unreadable. A woman in a lace veil joined in, her voice calm and measured. The numbers rose. Pound 80, 000, £90,000, £100,000. Each call met with a subtle shift in the crowd's posture, each counterbid tightening the invisible net of anticipation. Soon it was down to two, Lord Winthrop and the hawk-nosed man. Winthrop's face flushed with the heat of competition. The hawk-nosed man remained as composed as marble. £150,000, £155,000, £160,000. The auctioneer's voice carried through the hush. For the third and final time, the gavel fell with a crisp crack. The hawk-nosed man had won. Polite applause followed, but it ended abruptly when a sharp gasp broke the air. The hawk-nosed man swayed, his hand clutching at his chest. His eyes widened in sudden terror, and then he collapsed, striking his head against the marble floor. His champagne glass rolled from his limp hand, spilling its golden contents across the pale stone. For a moment there was only shock, chair scraping, voices rising in confusion, before the crowd surged in a disorganized wave. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. The young woman with the clutch bag screamed. Poirot moved quickly, kneeling beside the fallen man. He was already still, his eyes fixed and unblinking, a faint foam clinging to the corner of his mouth. And then, in the midst of the commotion, Poirot's gaze flicked upward, just in time to see the auctioneer slip something small and metallic into the pocket of his coat. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Velvet Hall. For a moment after the hawk-nosed man's body struck the marble, time seemed to hesitate. as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then reality broke in with a rush of sound, gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as people stumbled back from the fallen figure. The delicate clink of crystal against the floor was swallowed by the growing murmur, each voice heavy with confusion and fear. The Faberge egg remained on its velvet stand, gleaming under the spotlight, but in the crowd's shifting shadows it no longer looked like a prize. It looked like bait. Poirot straightened slowly from his crouch beside the man, glancing toward the auctioneer, who had stepped back from the podium, his thin face unreadable. The assistants hovered behind him, their hands twitching as though unsure whether to move the egg or leave it untouched. Lady Eleanor was at Poirot's side in a moment, her voice low but taut. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, his eyes still on the auctioneer's pocket. "This is most inconvenient, madam." She caught his meaning without looking, her gloved fingers tightening on the handle of her clutch. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the entryway as the Harrington House staff, pale-faced and stiff-backed, moved to close the great oak doors. A butler turned the key with a decisive click, and the weight of it settled over the room like a sentence. No one would be leaving until the matter was seen to. The first uniformed constable arrived shortly after, the rain still dripping from the brim of his helmet. He looked around the grand hall as though stepping into a world far removed from his beat, but his hesitation lasted only a moment before he bent to examine the fallen man. Poirot watched with polite interest as the constable's hand hovered over the champagne glass, then withdrew without touching it. "Doctor on the way," the man muttered to his companion, who had followed close behind. Poirot, never one to waste an opportunity, inclined his head and spoke in a voice that carried just enough authority to invite compliance. "If you please, messrs, I have some small experience in matters of this nature. Until your inspector arrives, perhaps you would permit me to make the most basic of observations." The constable hesitated, glancing toward Lady Eleanor, who gave a single, imperceptible nod. That was enough. Poirot began with the body, his movements precise and almost delicate. The hawk-nosed man's complexion had already taken on the pallor of death, but his skin bore no signs of a prolonged struggle. The faint foam at his lips was a detail Poirot lingered on, his eyes narrowing slightly. Poison, perhaps, swift, potent, and administered in a way that left no opportunity for intervention. The champagne glass, still bearing a ring of condensation, lay on its side nearby. Its contents had spread in a thin arc, catching the light like spilt gold. Poirot looked at it without touching it, then allowed his gaze to drift to the auctioneer, who had stepped down from the podium and now stood with his arms folded, his expression arranged into one of polite concern. That small metallic object, slipped into his pocket moments earlier, was not forgotten. The constables began to usher the guests into smaller groups, herding them toward the edges of the hall. Some protested, others whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes darting toward the egg as though it might somehow spring to life and reveal the truth. Poirot moved among them with the quiet inevitability of a tide, his mustache twitching slightly as he catalogued their faces. Lord Winthrop was pacing near the display cases, muttering under his breath, his flushed cheeks blotchy with frustration. The woman in the lace veil sat rigidly on a velvet bench, her gaze fixed on the floor, her fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles shone white. The young woman with the small clutch stood near the doorway, the tall, hawk-nosed man's absence. Beside her now, like a void she couldn't quite comprehend. She was pale, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Poirot filed each expression away, each posture, each careless remark caught in the ebb and flow of the crowd's low murmur. When the inspector arrived, a thick-set man with a bulldog's jaw and eyes that missed little, Poirot stepped back, content for the moment to watch. Inspector Graves was his name, and he wasted no time in declaring the event a suspicious death. The egg was secured in its case, and carried by two assistants to the strong room under lock and key. But Poirot's gaze followed them, his mind already spinning threads between the bidders, the auctioneer, and the sudden collapse. Poison in the champagne seemed likely, but questions arose like weeds in the garden of his thoughts. Why here, in full view of so many? And what, if anything, had the Faberge egg to do with it? Poirot's first discreet inquiries began with the young woman in the clutch. She identified herself as Miss Clara Hensley, a secretary to a shipping magnate who had sent her to bid on his behalf. The hawk-nosed man, she explained, was not her companion by choice. He had approached her during the preview, speaking with an air of knowing her that she could not quite place. Poirot listened without interrupting, noting the tremor in her voice. When she mentioned his winning bid, Lord Winthrop was less cooperative, bristling at the implication that he might be questioned at all. "I bid fair and square, and I lost," he snapped, his eyes flicking toward the strong-room door. "I've no interest in what happened after." Yet Poirot saw the way his fists clenched when the dead man's name, Anton Marceau, was finally spoken aloud by the inspector. The auctioneer, when approached, was all polished courtesy. He expressed his regret at the unfortunate incident and offered to provide the inspector with full records of the evening's transactions. His hands, however, were never still, and once or twice Poirot caught him patting his coat pocket, as if reassuring himself of the object hidden there. A harmless habit? Or something more? By the time the body was removed and the guests given leave to depart, save for a handful the inspector insisted remain, Poirot had formed the beginnings of a theory. Not enough to name a killer, but enough to know that the answer lay not in the egg's glittering surface, but in the shadows cast around it. And so, as the rain continued its quiet drumming against the tall windows, Poirot leaned lightly on his cane and said, almost to himself, "The murderer, he is here still. And the egg, ah, mon ami, it is not at all what it seems." Chapter 3. The Pattern in the Gold. The rain outside had deepened into a steady percussion, a rhythm that underscored the quiet tension inside the Harrington auction house. The grand hall, once alive with the buzz of conversation and the glint of champagne flutes, now lay muted, its opulence seeming almost oppressive in the aftermath of death. The chandeliers still cast their warm light, but it no longer felt inviting. Instead, it illuminated faces drawn tight with suspicion and unease. Most of the guests had been released into the night under the watchful gaze of constables stationed at the door, their carriages and motor cars vanishing into the wet darkness. Those who remained were not free to go, and knew it. Lord Winthrop stood by the long table that had displayed the Faberge egg, his shoulders stiff, his ruddy complexion flushed with what might have been anger, or perhaps the residue of humiliation. The woman in the lace veil sat perfectly still in a high-backed chair, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the here and now, as though she were replaying the evening in her mind with forensic precision. Miss Clara Hensley lingered near the wall, her clutch bag clutched still tighter, her expression one of quiet dread. The auctioneer, pale and meticulous, hovered near the side doors, his eyes flicking between Inspector Graves and Poirot, as though calculating which man posed the greater danger to his peace of mind. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his cane lightly balanced before him, his head bowed just enough to suggest contemplation rather than command. He did not speak for a long while, letting the silence lengthen until the others felt it pressing against them. When at last he did, his voice was soft but precise. "It is curious, N.S.C. Pa," he said, "how beauty can distract us from danger. This egg, this masterpiece, it has commanded all eyes tonight. And yet, M.E.S. Amos, perhaps it was not the egg that was truly of value." His words drew the faintest reaction. A flicker of the eyes from Lord Winthrop, a subtle tightening of the lace-veiled woman's jaw, a faint tremor from Clara's hand. Inspector Graves, who had been speaking with a constable by the door, turned toward him. Meaning what exactly? His tone was skeptical, but it was the kind of skepticism that hides curiosity. Poirot's mustache twitched almost imperceptibly. Meaning, mon cher inspecteur, that we must look not only at what was taken, but at what was never meant to be noticed. The strong room lay beneath the auction floor, a secure chamber carved into the building's foundations. The door was a massive slab of steel, the hinges hidden, the lock a mechanism that clicked in a manner so precise it might have been tuned like an instrument. The egg had been placed there for safekeeping after the collapse, and it was to this room that Poirot now requested entry. Graves allowed it, albeit reluctantly, assigning 2 constables to accompany them. The air in the strong room was cooler, drier, the scent of stone and metal more pronounced. The egg sat once more on its velvet-lined case under the harsh light of a ceiling lamp, and in this light, Poirot saw it differently. He did not touch it immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around it, his small patent leather shoes clicking softly on the floor. His eyes traced the intricate gold lattice, the enamel panels, the tiny diamonds that caught and refracted the light like water in motion. "Do you see, Inspector?" he murmured. Graves stepped closer. "See what?" Poirot bent slightly, his gaze narrowing to a single panel near the egg's base. The pattern. Every panel is identical in its motif, save for this one. Here, the gold twists not once, but twice, before it meets the diamond. A craftsman's error? None. In the House of Faberge, such an error would never leave the workshop. This is deliberate. Graves frowned, leaning in. A hidden compartment. Poirot's eyes glimmered. Perhaps, or perhaps a message, one visible only to those who know where to look. He straightened, glancing briefly at the constables, before turning toward the inspector. "Tell me, was Monsieur Marceau in possession of the egg at any time before this evening?" Graves shook his head. "Not that we know of. This was his first bid here. Won it clean, far as I can tell, then dropped dead before he could collect it." Poirot nodded slowly, as if confirming something only he could see. Back upstairs, Poirot began what he called the gentle probing. He spoke first with Clara Hensley, drawing her into a quiet alcove away from the others. She was reluctant. At first, her eyes darting toward the door as though longing to be gone. But Poirot's manner, calm, unthreatening, tinged with the faintest paternal warmth, loosened her reserve. She admitted that her employer, Mr. Henry Blackwood, had been seeking the Faberge egg for months, but not for its aesthetic value. He said it might contain something," she whispered. "Something that was hidden there during the Russian Revolution. He never told me what, but he said people would kill for it." Her voice faltered at the word kill, and she pressed the clutch tighter to her chest. Lord Winthrop proved more difficult, scoffing at Poirot's inquiries. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with Marceau's death, you're wasting your time," he snapped. "I've wanted that egg for years. Yes, but I don't go about poisoning my rivals. I play fair." But Poirot noted the way his eyes strayed toward the strong room door, and how his hand drifted to his waistcoat pocket as if to reassure himself of something hidden there. The woman in the lace veil was the last he approached. Her name, she said, was Madame Vassilieva, and she had traveled from Paris for the auction. Her voice was low, accented, her manner calm to the point of severity. When asked about Marceau, she claimed only a passing acquaintance. They had attended the same auction in Geneva 2 years prior. But when Poirot mentioned the unusual pattern on the egg, her eyes met his for the briefest instant, and in that instant he saw recognition, quickly masked. "You are mistaken, monsieur," she said evenly. "All the panels are the same." She turned her head slightly, and the lace veil shifted, revealing the faintest scar at her jawline. Poirot filed it away without comment. By the end of the hour, Poirot had gathered threads, small, fragile, and incomplete. But together they began to suggest a tapestry, a hidden feature in the egg, multiple bidders with urgent, private motives. A victim who may have known too much, and a murder committed in full view of a room that saw nothing. Standing once more beneath the grand chandelier, Poirot looked toward the closed doors of the strong room and murmured, "The pattern in the gold. It is like the pattern of the crime. One detail out of place, and it changes everything." Chapter 4. The Last Lock. The morning after the discovery in the vaulted library was unlike any the household had known. The corridors seemed to hum with an invisible current, the air both expectant and tense, as though the very walls understood that the end was drawing near. The rain, which had been a steady companion for days, now softened into a mist that clung to the windows, blurring the view of the gardens into watercolor smears of green and gray. Noah walked slowly, his steps measured, the weight of 3 chapters worth of unanswered riddles pressing against his ribs. He carried with him the map they had pieced together, the fragments of gold leaf, the scrawled Latin phrases, the strange spiral symbols that had repeated themselves in the chapel carvings, the tapestry border, and the secret panel behind the study. Each clue had felt separate once, an island of confusion in a sea of uncertainty. But now, the more he studied them, the more they wove into a single, deliberate pattern. And patterns, Noah knew, always had an architect. The path led him back to the great hall, to the portrait of Eleanor Ashcombe, whose painted eyes had followed him since the first night. In the light of dawn, something about the painting felt different. Not the face, not the colors, but the frame. The gilding was richer here than on any other in the house, its gold leaf patterned with the same repeating spiral, almost imperceptible unless one knew to look. He pressed his fingers against the lower edge, half expecting cold wood. Instead, it yielded slightly. A latch, hidden under centuries of polish. The frame swung forward with a sound like an exhale, revealing not a cavity, but a lock unlike any he had seen. 3 concentric rings of metal, each etched with the symbols from the map. The last lock, he turned the rings slowly, aligning spiral to spiral, the faint click of each rotation echoing in the hollow space behind the wall. The air changed. Somewhere deep inside, a mechanism groaned awake after decades of silence. When the final ring clicked into place, there was a soft thud, and the panel beside the portrait slid open, revealing a narrow, dust-filled passage. The scent was old, parchment, candle wax, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs. Noah stepped. Inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight, his lantern casting long shadows that seemed to move just ahead of him, as if guiding him toward the truth. The passage ended at a chamber no bigger than a pantry, its walls lined with shelves, upon which lay a collection of journals, sealed letters, and small locked boxes. In the center stood a pedestal draped in black velvet, and upon it, the missing piece, a medallion of solid gold, engraved with the complete spiral, its grooves deep and precise. Around its edge, in the same Latin hand as the map, the words Custos Veritatis, keeper of the truth. Noah reached for it, and in that moment, the room seemed to breathe. A presence, not malevolent, but watchful, filled the air, the weight of history pressing against him. He understood then. This was not treasure for wealth, but for revelation. The medallion was a key, not to a lock, but to the entire story. The centuries-long cycle of concealment and rediscovery. The reason the Ashcombe name had endured even as its fortunes faded. When he returned to the hall, the others were waiting. The map was laid on the table, the gold medallion placed at its center. As Noah explained each clue, each hidden link between the chapel, the tapestry, the panel, and the portrait, the picture became clear. Generations of careful guardianship, each leaving behind a piece of the puzzle for the next, ensuring the truth was never fully lost, but never fully found, until now. The house seemed lighter for it, the shadows less heavy, as though the walls themselves approved of the ending. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the gardens in full again. For the first time in weeks, sunlight touched the gold on the portrait's frame, making it gleam like a silent nod of approval. No one knew the cycle was broken, but also that the medallion would need its next keeper. Some truths were too powerful to live unguarded. He placed it back in the velvet-lined box, locked it, and set it in the vault beneath the library, knowing someone, someday, would begin the search anew. And if you followed this journey through every twist, shadow, and hidden passage, then you understand. Mysteries like these don't end. They wait. And when they call, they demand an answer. So if you're ready for the next one, for the next lock, the next pattern in the gold, make sure you're here when the door opens again, because you won't want to miss what waits behind it. Subscribe, stay close, and remember, every shadow hides a story.